Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. South Africans continue to be squeezed in a tight corner with the latest increase in consumer price index for the second consecutive month in March. Now, the CPI now stands at 7.1%, with food and beverage prices being the biggest contributors to the latest increase. Now, this increase has raised fears of another interest rate hike. For more on this, I'm joined by Patrick Kelly, who is the Chief Director responsible for price statistics. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Food prices continue their upward trend, representing the largest annual increase in 14 years. The price of maize meal, which really stood out because it's an important staple in South Africa, continues to see high rates of inflation. These figures are not encouraging at all and clearly show that we're moving towards a lot of strain on South Africans.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, 7.1% as an overall inflation rate is already, over the Reserve Bank's target range and much higher than we've seen in many years in South Africa. And obviously, when you're talking food inflation, that's something that really, hits people in the stomach, literally. We've been seeing food inflation creeping up over, probably the last year or so. And as you say, we're now at the levels that we last saw in March 2009. March 2009 was also a kind of global crisis. If we think back quite far, there were oil prices were going up. There were big issues around biofuels in the US where they wanted to turn maize into oil. There were global weather issues as well. And we were just going into and coming out of the global financial crisis. And so there were, terrible economic conditions as well. And then more recently, perhaps in between then and now, we had a drought in 2016, which also caused a spike, but not as high as we have at the moment, in food prices.
So you give us a build-up of how we could have landed in this situation. But what would you say are some of the glaring biggest contributors this time around?
Well, look, I mean, we came out of COVID. We had a war in Ukraine. So those were two key kind of global events that took place that do impact on production. Production goes down, prices go up typically. There have been adverse weather conditions in different parts of the world. So, I mean, if we just take cooking oil as an example, which was climbing before we even hit COVID, that was all about drought in South America. And those prices now actually started to come down a bit. And maize, wheat prices are also really a factor of global conditions. I think we could also look at kind of input costs. So we've had very high oil prices. Oil impacts not just on your driving your tractor, but also on the fertilizer that you use, other chemicals that you put in. So these are some of the key issues that kind of combine, I think, to cause generally high food inflation. And South Africa is not alone, so we really can look to some of these global factors as drivers of that.
So how much of a dent have we encountered with other increases, like looking at housing, utilities, fuel, and so forth?
Yeah, so, I mean, if we want to look at food in particular, there's what are the input costs? So if maize goes up, you've got to feed your cows. Typically, that's what we feed cows is maize and oil cakes and the like. Some of the other factors in the inflation basket more generally are climbing, but perhaps not at such heavy rates. So, we've just published education fees. They went up by about 5.5% overall. Housing costs, the actual costs of housing are fairly moderate at the moment. That's around 3%, and that's quite a large part of the CPI basket. But we will be looking into going forward, for example, electricity costs. We're told it's going to be an 18% increase by NERSA. So we'll have to then see how that plays through, because clearly electricity, as is fuel, a key kind of input into food production.
Are there some rays of hope emerging somewhere out in the horizon? Could we see inflation coming down in the next few months? Because global food prices, as far as I understand, have been coming down in the last few months. Are we likely to mimic the situation?
Yeah, I mean, because there's many moving parts, difficult to say what will happen. But absolutely, you're right that the UN's food index has started to climb down over the last 12 months. The rates that we've seen, for example, for bread and cereal products, for meat, These are actually off their highs that we've seen recently. And these are kind of the big weight items in the food basket. So, similarly, cooking oil and margarine have also come down. In fact, they've been coming down for the past 7 months, actually dropping in price, so that's quite encouraging. So at the moment, within the food group, we see really the dairy products and vegetables are kind of on the way up, but the rest of them are kind of coming down. What happens with fuel prices is always a key driver of what happens with inflation in the short term. So I'll leave you to speculate about that. But, those will be the sorts of things one would want to look at.
So looking at trends, are there any survival strategies that you've seen, perhaps in past breakdowns in terms of what consumers are sort of doing, how they're maneuvering around this, and perhaps if they're looking at options right now, what's to be done?
Yeah, I mean, we don't track a Stats SA consumer expenditure on a kind of month-to-month basis, so it's really difficult to say. I think that the key thing one wants to look at from an overall inflation perspective is to what extent do these areas where we don't really have a lot of control, like food and fuel inflation, how much do they percolate through into other categories of inflation, for example, furniture or clothing or services. And at the moment, although we could look at what we might call core inflation, which also strips out some energy costs, and that's at around 5% compared to the 7.1% overall, which means that, although it has ticked up, we're not seeing a massive push through of inflation through to other areas. Now, that may be because consumers are withholding some expenditure. We know interest rates are very high. That would also deter people from spending on other categories that are not really necessities.
Yeah. So what would you say, very lastly, before we let you go, what would you say would consumers take home as a result of these latest figures? I mean, what are some of the considerations and the key questions or perhaps solutions that consumers should be looking to at a time like this? I mean, you made mention, as we were chatting, about the different years and what we've seen in those past years. I mean, are there some take-homes and lessons from then which we could use to navigate now?
Maybe we should grow our own vegetables. Vegetable inflation is ticking up quite significantly. Look, I mean, I think that everyone needs to be prudent with their expenditure. If I looked at the price changes in a normal CPI data set, we see a few big increases, we see a few decreases, and a lot of it remains the same. But that would vary from month to month, from shop to shop. And so I expect that people could probably look around and try and see where can they get the best prices. But ultimately, we've kind of got to bite through this one. And as you said earlier, are there rays of hope? And there are some rays of hope. I think most of the economists out there are seeing some sort of moderation in food prices as well as overall inflation as we move into the kind of middle third quarter of the year. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, hopefully the next time you come here, you'll be the bearer of good news. Thank you so much for your time. Patrick Kelly, Chief Director, responsible for price statistics at Stats SA. Thank you for your time.